6 weeks before he died, the man who paid to open King Tut's tomb was told to his face that he had 6 weeks to live. He laughed it off. 6 weeks later, almost to the day, he was dead. His name was Lord Carnarvon, and the cause of death, written on the record, was almost insultingly ordinary. A mosquito bite. He nicked it while shaving, it got infected, and a wealthy English earl who had already survived a near-fatal car crash was killed by a shaving cut. That was the story. That was what the world was told. Except the men who opened that tomb kept dying, one after another. A visitor who came just to see the treasure, Carnarvon's own brother, the team's specialists, and within a few years, the newspapers had a name for it: the Curse of the Pharaohs. For 100 years, that curse has been treated as two things, and only two things: either superstition, a ghost story for tourists, or coincidence, a run of bad luck dressed up as revenge. Nobody serious believed there was a physical cause. Nothing inside that tomb could reach out and kill a grown man. Then scientists went back in with modern equipment. They scanned the chamber, they sampled the air, the dust, the surfaces of the walls, and what they found was not gold, and it was not a ghost. It was alive, a living thing that had been sealed in total darkness for more than 3,000 years, still viable, still dangerous, and perfectly capable of doing exactly what the legend described. Today we are going to go through what that thing actually is, what it does to the human lungs the moment you breathe it, why it took a second tomb and 10 more dead scientists to finally prove it, and the twist almost nobody saw coming. Because the killer they pulled out of King Tut's tomb is now sitting in a laboratory in the United States. And it might save your life. Let's set the scene fast, because the timeline is the whole case. Tutankhamun was a boy. He came to the throne around the age of 9, and he was dead before 20, somewhere around 1323 BCE. In life, he was a minor pharaoh, half forgotten almost as soon as he was buried. His tomb was small, cramped, and dug into the floor of the Valley of the Kings, under the debris of a grander one nearby. It was given the unremarkable catalog number KV62, and because it was small and buried under rubble, it was missed. Grave robbers stripped almost every royal tomb in that valley within a few centuries. Tut's was overlooked for more than 3,000 years. That is the only reason you know his name. Not because he mattered in life, because his tomb stayed sealed. In November of 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter, funded entirely by Lord Carnarvon, found the top of a hidden staircase. On the 26th of November, Carter chiseled a small hole through a plastered doorway, held up a candle, and looked into a room no living person had entered since the Bronze Age. Carnarvon, standing behind him in the dark, asked if he could see anything. Carter said the line that made him immortal: "Yes, wonderful things." Here is what almost no retelling mentions. Something came out of that hole before Carter's eyes even adjusted. Air. Carter's own notes describe hot air escaping from the chamber as the seal broke. More than 3,000 years of stale, sealed, organic air, and the first men to lean into the gap breathed it straight in. Hold on to that detail. It is going to matter more than anything else in this story. If you find buried history as unsettling as I do, subscribe and turn on the bell, because the deeper we go into this one, the less it looks like a legend and the more it looks like a crime scene. Now, the curse. Everybody has heard the phrase. Almost nobody knows it was never real, at least not the way you were told. There is a famous line, supposedly carved at the entrance to the tomb: "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." It gets quoted in documentaries, in films, in 100 spooky retellings. There is only one problem with it. It was never found in the tomb. There is no such inscription. The line was invented by a popular novelist named Marie Corelli, who 2 weeks before Carnarvon's death wrote a letter to a magazine warning that dire punishment would follow anyone who broke into a sealed pharaoh's tomb. When Carnarvon died days later, she was hailed as a prophet, and a myth was born. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes and a devout spiritualist, went on the record blaming Carnarvon's death on elementals, invisible guardian spirits placed by the priests of Tutankhamun. And the story fed on itself. It was reported that at the exact moment Carnarvon died, every light in Cairo went out. That, back at his estate in England, his dog let out a single howl and dropped dead. None of it verified. All of it printed. The legend grew faster than anyone could check it. So the supernatural curse is fiction, a novelist's fantasy amplified by a bored press. For decades, that was the end of the argument. Curse debunked, case closed. But that explanation has a problem. It explains the story, it does not explain the bodies. Because when you stop reading the curse as a ghost story and start reading it as a medical report, something strange happens. The deaths stop looking random. They start looking like a pattern. And the pattern points somewhere very specific. That's clue number 1, and it hides in plain sight. Look at how these people actually died. Lord Carnarvon first. He was bitten by a mosquito on the cheek in the Valley of the Kings. He tore the bite open while shaving, and it became infected. That infection was diagnosed as erysipelas, a streptococcal infection of the skin, followed by blood poisoning. Then it moved to his chest. He developed pneumonia. On the 5th of April, 1923, in a hotel in Cairo, his organs failed and he died. He was 56 years old. And here is the part that gets left out. Carnarvon was already a semi-invalid. A brutal car accident years earlier had wrecked his health and left him with weak, damaged lungs, prone to severe respiratory infections. His immune system was compromised long before he ever set foot in that tomb. A man in his condition could be killed by an infection that a healthy person would shrug off. Then it kept going. George J. Gould, a wealthy American financier, came to visit the tomb in 1923. He fell ill almost immediately after his visit, developed a fever, and was dead within weeks. Cause of death, pneumonia. Aubrey Herbert, Carnarvon's half-brother, died 5 months after the Earl, of blood poisoning that set in after a dental operation. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, a radiologist who was brought in specifically to X-ray the mummy, fell ill and died in early 1924. Arthur Mace, one of the senior members of the excavation team, the man who helped Carter dismantle the sealed doorway, went into a long decline with a progressive respiratory condition and died in 1928. Richard Bethel, Carnarvon's personal secretary and the first man behind Carter to step into the tomb, was found dead in his bed, smothered, in 1929. And the legend swept up deaths that had nothing to do with any of this. Hugh Evelyn White, an archaeologist connected to the excavation, hanged himself, reportedly terrified that the curse was coming for him. Aaron Ember, an American Egyptologist who knew many of the people present at the opening, died in 1926 when his house burned down, and the manuscript he ran back inside to save was, of all things, a work titled The Egyptian Book of the Dead. Eerie, yes, but a suicide and a house fire are not a curse, and they are not our killer. A real investigation has to separate the noise from the signal. So set the coincidences aside and look only at the deaths that share a cause. Strip away the ghosts and lay those deaths side by side. Look at what runs through them. The chest, the lungs, pneumonia, fever, blood poisoning that spread into the respiratory system. Progressive lung disease. Over and over, the men closest to that tomb are dying of the same category of thing. Something in the airways. Something you breathe. Death on swift wings was never about a curse. Wings, air, breath. If you were an ancient people or a superstitious public, and you watched men who entered a sealed chamber start dying of their lungs, an invisible thing that comes on the air is exactly how you would describe it. Not a metaphor, a description. They were telling you the killer was airborne, and nobody was listening. So if the killer is in the air, the question becomes simple. What was in the air of that tomb? And that's clue number 2. For 3,000 years, KV-62 was a sealed box, and it was not an empty box. When the Egyptians buried a pharaoh, they packed the tomb with everything he would need in the afterlife. Food, baskets of grain, bread, dried meat, fruit, jars of oils and perfumes, wooden furniture, linen wrappings, woven mats, flowers. Tutankhamun was even buried with floral collars, real garlands laid across the shrines. All of it organic. All of it sealed inside a warm, dark, initially humid chamber and then left completely undisturbed for over 3 millennia. If you wanted to design the perfect incubator for mold, you could not do better than an Egyptian tomb. Organic fuel, no light, no disturbance, and time. Vast amounts of time. Certain molds do not just grow in a place like that. They colonize it, and then, when the food runs out and the air dries, they do something remarkable. They go dormant. They pack themselves into spores, microscopic armored seeds that can survive for centuries. Waiting. They do not die. They wait for the air to move and a warm, moist pair of lungs to arrive. Now go back to Carter breaking that seal. The hot air escaping the chamber. That was not just stale air. That was 3,000 years of sealed spores getting their first current of moving air in the history of the tomb. And go back to Carter's own diary, because there is a line in it that should stop you cold. He describes Lord Carnarvon on one of his early trips into the tomb, crawling along the floor of the chamber, down in the dust, face down in exactly the layer where dormant spores would have settled and concentrated. A man with ruined lungs and a weakened immune system, crawling through the one place in the world most likely to be carpeted in ancient mold, breathing it in. The mold has a name, Aspergillus, and one species in particular, Aspergillus flavus, is one of the most notorious toxic molds on Earth. It produces spores that can lie dormant for centuries. When those spores are disturbed and inhaled, they can cause a violent respiratory infection called aspergillosis. Here is what that actually means inside a human body. The spores are small enough to travel past every defense in the airway and lodge deep in the warm, wet tissue of the lungs. And there, they do what they were waiting 3,000 years to do. They germinate. They send out branching filaments that grow through the lung like roots through soil. And as they grow, some strains release toxins that poison the surrounding tissue. In a healthy person with a strong immune system, this is often fought off before it takes hold. But in someone whose defenses are already broken down, someone like a semi-invalid Earl with scarred lungs, aspergillosis can bleed into the lungs, spread to the brain, the heart, the kidneys, and kill. In 2003, the medical journal The Lancet looked at exactly this. They walked through Carnarvon's death and pointed out the obvious. A man with a long history of severe lung disease crawled through a sealed tomb thick with 3,000 years of undisturbed organic dust and breathed in a lungful of hot, spore-laden air. For a man in his condition, exposure to that kind of toxic mold could absolutely have been fatal. Not a curse, a biological ambush that had been armed and waiting since the Bronze Age. And it was not only mold. Sealed tombs accumulate other things too. As organic material breaks down over thousands of years, it can release ammonia, formaldehyde, and hydrogen sulfide. Trapped, concentrated, poisonous gases. The kind of invisible chemical air that could sicken anyone who opened the door and breathed before it cleared. The ancient Egyptians, and the modern press, called it the breath of the tomb. The chemistry just calls it a sealed, contaminated environment. This is where the word scam actually earns its place in this story. For a century, all anyone had was a 100-year-old death certificate and a legend. But KV-62 never stopped being studied. In the last 2 decades, teams have gone back into Tutankhamun's tomb with ground-penetrating radar and high-resolution imaging, mapping the walls inch by inch, hunting for hidden chambers behind the plaster. That same generation of instruments, radar, thermal scans, and modern microbial sampling is what finally let researchers ask a question the men of 1922 could never answer. Not what does this tomb contain in gold, but what does it contain that is alive? And once you can scan for that, the answer stops being a ghost story and starts being data. For decades, this theory was dismissed as speculation. A nice idea, critics said, but where is the proof? You cannot exactly prove that a mold killed a man who has been dead for 100 years. And they were right. You would need to see it happen again, in another sealed tomb, to another team, under conditions clean enough to actually study. That's the third clue. And it is the one nobody wanted, because to get it, more people had to die. In 1973, in Poland, a team of 12 scientists received permission to open a different tomb, not Egyptian. The crypt of King Casimir IV, a 15th century Polish king, sealed beneath a cathedral in Krakow. 12 researchers went in to study the royal remains. Within a matter of weeks and months, 10 of them were dead. 10 out of 12. And this time it was not the 1920s. This time there were microbiologists, there was equipment, there was the ability to actually go looking for a cause. So they looked, and inside the tomb, around the king's remains, they found it. Aspergillus flavus, the same toxic mold, the same dormant killer, sealed in the dark, waiting for a team of humans to break the seal and breathe. Sit with what that means. This is not a story about one unlucky earl and a mosquito bite. It is a repeatable event, a sealed royal tomb, opened by modern people, followed by a wave of deaths, with the same specific fungus found at the scene. Not similar circumstances, not a vague echo. The same mechanism in two different countries, 5 decades apart. The curse of the pharaohs, stripped of the pharaohs, is a documented biological hazard. Now, the official record around all of this has always been strangely clean, and that is worth pausing on. Howard Carter himself spent years insisting, publicly and repeatedly, that there was nothing dangerous in the tomb. No poison, no biological trap, no curse of any kind. He needed the world to believe the site was safe, and mostly the world obliged. But the tidy version of events kept colliding with facts that did not fit. The mosquito story, for instance. It became the accepted cause of Carnarvon's infection, and yet there were essentially no mosquitoes in the bone-dry Valley of the Kings before the Aswan High Dam changed the region's water table decades later. The neat explanation for the bite does not survive contact with the geography. And there is the matter of the mummy itself. When Carter's team finally got to Tutankhamun's body, the king was fused into his coffin by hardened resins, and getting him out was, by later accounts, a violent process involving heat and brute force that left the mummy dismembered. That was not something the public was told at the time. The clean official narrative, the one printed in the papers, quietly left the messier reality out, which tells you something about how much of this story was managed. When the record is curated this carefully, the gaps in it stop looking like accidents. So we have a pattern of respiratory deaths, a tomb that functions as a spore incubator, a named toxic fungus, and a second tomb where the same fungus appears to have killed 10 scientists. The pieces fit. It is tempting to slam the case shut right here and declare the curse solved. The killer was mold. The end. But now let's slow down, because if we are being honest, and this channel is going to be honest with you, the story is not that simple, and the skeptics have a case that deserves a fair hearing. Does any of this prove that a supernatural curse killed the men who opened King Tut's tomb? No, it does not, and you should be suspicious of anyone who tells you it does. Start with the numbers, because the numbers are brutal for the curse. A researcher went back and counted everyone who was present when the tomb and the sarcophagus were actually opened. 58 people stood in that chamber during the key moments. Of those 58, only 8 died within the following dozen years. The rest lived on for years, for decades. That is not a massacre. That is roughly what you would expect from any group of adults, many of them elderly, over a span of years. And the biggest problem for the curse is the one man who should have been its first victim, Howard Carter. He found the tomb. He broke the seals with his own hands. He spent a decade of his life crawling in and out of that chamber, breathing its air more than any human alive. If the tomb was a death trap, Carter should have been the first to fall. Instead, he lived until 1939. He died 16 years later of a cancer of the lymphatic system at the age of 64. No sudden collapse, no swift wings. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carnarvon's daughter, was among the very first people to squeeze into the tomb in 1922. She lived another 57 years and died in 1980. Another man present at the opening lived 39 years after the event. In 2002, the British Medical Journal ran the actual statistics. They compared the people exposed to the tomb against those who were not, and they found no significant difference in how long they lived. No measurable curse effect at all. And the curse legend itself, we already know, was manufactured. A novelist's warning, a spiritualist's ghost story, a press pack locked out of an exclusive news deal and desperate for anything to print. The supernatural curse is, start to finish, a media invention. So, the extreme version of the story is dead. There is no vengeful spirit. There is no inscription promising death on swift wings. There is no evidence that touching King Tut's mummy shortens your life. But here is the thing that the skeptics, in their rush to kill the ghost story, sometimes forget to say. Killing the ghost does not make the biology go away, because every grounded, boring, skeptical fact we just went through leaves the real discovery completely intact. Sealed tombs really do grow toxic fungi. Aspergillus flavus really does produce spores that survive for thousands of years and really does cause lethal lung infections in vulnerable people. The pollen deaths really happened, and the fungus really was found there. And Lord Carnarvon really was an immunocompromised man with wrecked lungs who really did crawl through the dust of a 3,000-year-old chamber and breathe its air weeks before dying of a respiratory collapse. The curse as magic is false. The tomb as a genuine biological hazard is true. And a true, invisible, ancient killer that waits in the dark and attacks the lungs of the unprepared is far more unsettling than any ghost, precisely because it is real. It does not need you to believe in it. It only needs you to breathe. And this is where the story turns into something almost no one expects, because the ancient killer they identified in that tomb did not stay a killer. In June of 2025, a team of researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, led by a bioengineer named Sherry Gao, published a study in the journal Nature Chemical Biology. Their subject was Aspergillus flavus, the same toxic mold suspected of killing the men who opened King Tut's tomb and the scientists who opened King Casimir's. They took this notorious organism, the so-called Pharaoh's curse, in fungal form into the lab, and they took it apart at the molecular level, hunting for the chemistry behind its lethality. What they pulled out of it was a new class of molecules they named asparagimycins. And when they modified those molecules and put them up against human leukemia cells, the results were startling. The compounds tore into the cancer cells, disrupting the way they divide and multiply. 2 of the versions they engineered were so potent that they performed on par with cytarabine and daunorubicin, 2 chemotherapy drugs already approved and used to treat leukemia. The fungus that may have suffocated a dozen tomb explorers turned out to be carrying, in its own venom, a potential weapon against one of the deadliest cancers we know. The lead researcher called it nature's irony at its finest. The same organism once feared for bringing death may now help save lives. The killer sealed in the pharaoh's tomb the invisible thing on swift wings, is being re-engineered into a cure. And that is the question this whole story finally leaves you with. If a mold that grew in the dark of one forgotten tomb turned out to hold a cancer-fighting compound we only found in 2025, then what else is dormant in the sealed places we have not opened yet? Every unexcavated tomb, every sealed crypt, every chamber we have scanned but never entered is its own little world that has been running undisturbed for thousands of years. Some of what is waiting in them can kill you, and some of it, apparently, can save you. We have almost no way of knowing which is which until we break the seal and breathe. King Tut's tomb is still there in the Valley of the Kings, exactly where it has been for over 3,000 years. The gold is in a museum now, but the tomb itself, the walls, the dust in the corners, the microscopic seeds pressed into 3,000 years of silence, none of that vanished when the treasure left. Aspergillus does not die. It waits, somewhere in the sealed tombs we have not opened, in the dark, patient and dormant, and older than every story we tell about it. The thing that killed the men who opened the last one is still there, still viable, still waiting for the seal to break. If this is the kind of buried history that keeps you up at night, watch the next investigation playing on screen right now, because the discovery in that one is even harder to explain. Subscribe before you go, so the next time something this old gives up a secret, you are the first to know.